So now I'd like to shift over to some of the issues here. You came to national attention probably initially as someone at Harvard who was teaching a very, very popular class on happiness. So here's a question. Why was there such an interest in happiness at Harvard? Or more personally, as I kind of said I would do, so I kind of warned you there, you were depressed yourself at Harvard. Why is it that so many people who are very successful and operating in many wonderful ways and also have the inner capabilities to get into a place like Harvard in the first place, why is it so many people who are successful are still really quite unhappy?
I think part of the reason is that success doesn't correlate with some of those positive attributes we thought it did. If somebody's success rates rise for the next 5 year period of time, their happiness levels flatline. We don't see any movement that's directly related to those successes. Interestingly, as an aside, you flip it around, raise somebody's levels of happiness and optimism, and their success rates do rise. So it seemed to go one direction. But I grew up in Waco, Texas. I didn't ever expect to get to go to Harvard. I was an valedictorian. I was a volunteer firefighter in Waco, and I applied on a dare. And when I got in, I thought, this is amazing. I'm going to be so happy. And then I got there and I was happy at first and grateful to be there. But I also noticed that 80% of the students, I later learned, report going through depression. 10% of the Harvard populace reports contemplating suicide at some time during their 4 years there, which was stunning and heartbreaking to watch these people with so much potential sometimes lose connection to the meaning within their own lives. But now that I've done this research, and this work in 50 countries, I realized that had nothing to do with Harvard. It had nothing to do with privileged students. It has to do with how every brain in the world processes the connection between your previous life successes, how much happiness you think you might be worthy of in the present, and what you think will happen in your near and far future. And if we have this mindset that as soon as I'm successful, then I'll be happier, we follow a formula for happiness and success: work harder, be successful, then I'll be happier. That doesn't work out empirically or when we look at the data, but flip it around and focus on levels of happiness like those students were in the class that Dr. Talvin Shahar created at Harvard. And that was a teaching fellow for that. It created this, um, it, it, it opened up and showed a hunger that people had to be able to pursue something that wasn't, how do I make more money or drive success? How do I actually find meaning and happiness in the midst of this?
Mm. Um, One of the things that's striking to me about what you do is that people can be outwardly successful and they can look resilient in one area. For example, they could have a setback in their work, in their career, and they keep on going. And yet, meanwhile, there's a kind of hollowness inside. They're sort of, they don't actually have a lot of resources inside. There's sort of this brittle exoskeleton, I think a little bit almost like a crab, let's say, very sturdy on the inside, but if you crack that shell for some reason, maybe there's a setback at work, a personal issue, or something just bubbles up, from their personal history, and then boom, they don't have a lot of capability, a lot of structure inside. They're
Yeah.
not actually that resilient on the inside out. And I wondered if you could speak to that, both as an issue and maybe start to sketch some of the things that you've seen can help with that over time.
So I experienced it myself. I was so good at checking off individual metrics of success. I could get good grades. I could graduate, with Harvard with honors. But we were never taught, how to create happiness or meaning or deep connection. In fact, we were taught success is zero sum and that to hyper compete and to hyper compare. So if somebody else is being more successful, my levels of happiness must drop within that survival of the fittest type system. I think survival of the fittest, as an aside, it creates a brittle system from the beginning. Especially when we start to look at big data, what we're starting to realize is we don't live in survival of the fittest. We actually live in a survival of the best fit. How does somebody best connect to the ecosystem of potential around them? It's much more predictive than whether or not you're the top dog in any certain arena. So I felt it for myself. I was brittle for a couple reasons. I grew up in Waco, Texas, so my religious understanding about the world was given to me and sometimes forced upon me, not by my parents, but the society. So I hadn't adopted those myself, and I was trying to be successful all by myself. And I think when I found myself as a proctor at Harvard, which was my job was to counsel 30 freshmen and live in the dorms with them and help them to make sure they don't get depressed. I went through depression myself because some of my own philosophical pillars had crumbled and need to be rebuilt, and to build up those beliefs that I owned and that had meaning for me. But also, I was lonely. And so I had success, but not other people. And I work with some celebrities now, and as their star ascends, they can't go to a Starbucks to get a coffee anymore. So they start to feel sequestered in their own homes. So they have everything in the world except social connection, and their levels of happiness plummet. I think the most fragile system is a completely independent system, that we become so much stronger when we start to recognize that we have to pursue happiness and success together.
I think that's a profoundly interesting and important idea. And one of the reasons why I really wanted you to be part of this Resilience Summit and to talk with you here, just to say it back to you. I'm a therapist, so of course I'll say it back to you.
Please.
Um, it's striking to me that we tend to locate resilience within the individual in a kind of isolated sense, and also locate the causes of well-being typically inside that individual. You're saying it's actually a matter of fit that inherently involves a relationship with individuals and a larger world around a person. And it's that quality of fit that is so important over the long haul, which is a 180-degree switch from the ordinary American culture kind of way of looking at things, Western culture probably generally. So in that, I wanted to ask you a question. Your most recent work talks about this notion of big potential, of an individual of success embedded in a frame of relatedness, and actually most fundamentally caused by and fueled by a frame of relatedness. But to experience things in that way is often really challenging in our culture. We have social forces, are competitive, people are more and more isolated. The sense of community connection is shredding. I think sometimes about the so-called village it takes to raise a child. It's more like a ghost town. So what do you see as some of the challenges culturally and economically and in terms of just how we operate as a country or the West in general? And then we can start getting into some of the solutions. So what are the challenges to achieving our big potential?
It's a great question and so much to unpack. I feel like, so I've been working on happiness for a while and going around talking about how happiness could be an advantage. But the reason that I wrote Big Potential is because I had a complete shift in the way that I looked at it. I've been arguing that you don't have to just be your genes and environment, that by making small individual choices, you could make happiness a choice within your life, or at least be able to choose a more positive mindset. Now I realize that that choice is not an individual one, it's an interconnected one. When I choose to be grateful in the midst of the challenges we see in our economic and political landscape or challenges in our life, I give other people license to be optimistic and grateful in those spaces, which makes them more positive, which makes it easier for me to be positive. So we see either a vicious cycle or virtuous cycle between my negative reaction to the world and a positive reaction to the world. But I think the challenges come at multiple levels. One of them, I think, starts with academia. We study you as individuals, right? Like, here's your intelligence, here's your creativity, here's your athleticism, here's your engagement, here's your resilience. And I think what you pointed out, and I agree with so much, is that those are all interconnected traits, right? If I want to test you on creativity, the typical way is I put you in a room by yourself as a participant and ask you how many different uses of a brick you can think of, right? But your creativity changes based upon the people that are around you. Humor, your personality, all of those things change. So I think the first thing we need to do is we need to change the way that we self-identify and that we test people to look at the interconnectedness of these traits instead of assuming I own all of my creativity, I own all of my humor or intelligence. But related to that, I think social media and the constant news cycle has had a pretty marked effect upon levels of happiness. We don't know the reason for this, but the CDC has found that depression rates have doubled over the past decade. Anxiety rates are at one of the highest levels. Hospitalizations for suicide have increased dramatically, doubled even for 8-year-olds. So I think part of the reason for that is we're hyper comparing on social media constantly. When I left school when I was younger, I was now home with my family or friends that they would pick, right, or had control over. But now I'm constantly exposed to all of the peers within that group and peers beyond that as well. So I'm easily hyper comparing, or I'm being constantly bombarded by that information, which can sometimes be negative. The other side is that as the world's become bigger, we feel like happiness only exists down certain paths. Like you can only be happy if you go to this school and not these other 19 schools you apply to, instead of recognizing that happiness could exist down all of those. So I think in our schools and our companies, we're teaching happiness only can happen with zero-sum success. And I think that creates a big challenge where people don't even want to pursue big potential because they're not sure that they want to help other people.
Yeah. I think one of the implications of what you're saying is that as people look inside at, let's say, rising levels of anxiety or depression, or they look inside and they see ways in which they're not that resilient, or they're brittle or prickly or highly reactive to something, sensitive to things. And people often tend to blame themselves. I'm a
Yeah.
longtime psychologist, and people tend to blame themselves for that. And one of the really important implications for me of what you're saying is that the sources of those internal issues,
Mm.
including weaknesses and resilience, are actually outside the individual, or they
Mm.
involve the individual in relationship with other larger forces. So it's not a personal fault necessarily. I think sometimes it's
Yes.
it's up to us to do something about it, but it's not our fault that it's the case.
Absolutely. I think that's so crucial because I think that the guilt only slows us down,
Yeah,
right? And I feel like people feel weighed down by these choices, and then they feel powerless within the systems. So what we want people to do is to recognize that they have a power to influence other people to create positive change, but that the problems themselves are not something that they've created. I don't know how many people I've talked to who wanted to be optimistic. They were optimistic and then they got cancer. And they were like, I was so positive, and yet negative things still happened to me. And they're
yeah.
blaming themselves for an
Mhm.
external event that their internal mindset couldn't stop. So one of the things I talk about is that we don't want irrational optimism, right? We don't want to
Right.
sugarcoat the world and think we can control everything. That the optimism has to be adaptive. Once something negative happens, how can I change my framing for this world to make it a more positive response?
Yeah. And as people do that, as they increase their well-being, as it were, from the inside out, authentically, um, how have you seen that that makes them more resilient?
It's a great question. I think that the more you get over, right, the more you feel resilient in the future. So I think that a lot of times, as we take these positive steps to see that our behavior matters and that we can get through challenging circumstances, we're more likely to then take on bigger challenges. One of the things I've been thinking about is, and I say it in with some of the big data research, is that if you stop smoking, that's great, but you will never reach your full health if everyone around you is still smoking, right? So then people's response is, great, I'm not hanging out with any people that are smoking or they're negative or that, are stressful or any of these types of things. And we don't have that type of control within our hyper connected world. Instead, I think that there's a better model. And that model is we try to create positive emotional immune system that you inoculate yourself against stress by practicing gratitudes, by practicing meditation, by looking for the meaning in your life, so that when you have those negative interactions, you have a storehouse of positive imagery, a storehouse of meaning in your life that helps to neutralize some of those negative effects that we see in the system. Much like a doctor knows all the negative that can happen if you're surrounded by sick people, but he or she washes their hands and then goes in and tries to meet with as many sick people as possible. And I think that that's my hope, is that we can build ourselves up with others and people that bring out the best in us instead of that stress. But then once we have that, we can help the people who are currently negative and expressing suffering.
Yeah. And one of the things we talk about in this Resilience Summit is the importance of when one is practicing gratitude, say,
Mm.
or finding meaning, or feeling cared about or caring.
Yeah.
It's really important to take a moment to help those experiences, these momentary states of being, to sink in and literally leave more lasting residues behind physically in lasting changes in neural structure or function, sort of
Wow.
hardwiring those experiences into oneself, moving from states to traits.
I
So,
love that. It's something I do too. It's just a brief aside, but one thing that's helped me build resilience is if I get negative reviews or an academic, criticizes something that I say,
one-star reviews on Amazon.
1-star reviews on Amazon, exactly, by somebody who clearly said they didn't read it. Like when that happens, I get frustrated and I feel like, well, my work doesn't matter, when I'm in a weak state, or I'm so tired of traveling all the time, whatever it is that I feel broken in that moment. I have an in case of emergency folder that I learned from some critical care nurses in Boston. And they said that they have all these horrible things that happen occasionally. But what they do is all year they collect into this, they have a manila envelope, I have a digital one, where I collect notes of people that said that this really mattered, or a teacher at a school who said, we've been practicing gratitude with our students, it was because of your work, and this is the impact it had, or you impacted these immigrants, or I was suicidal, whatever it is, that when I have that moment, I just can click on that inbox and I'm suddenly reminded, and my brain can focus back on the meaning that was there, that helps me overcome that one small setback that I'm currently experiencing there. It's been really helpful for me.